So hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Arye. I'm an intelligence analyst at CB Insights where I cover fintech for the past year blockchain. So if you can't see the slides, don't worry, we'll be sending them out afterwards. Now on to today's talk. So the title of this talk is Blockchain, Tokens, and Bitcoin, and that's intentional because different groups of people are using different terms to describe a lot of the same technology in the space. So nomenclature is certainly important. So let's get an overview of what we're going to cover today. The first thing we'll look at is the blockchain as corporate infrastructure thesis. This has been the blockchain but not Bitcoin idea that's been espoused by corporates for the past 4 years, I would say. Then we're going to look at the tokens, ICOs, and a decentralized web thesis. And the last thing we'll touch on is actually going back to basics, looking at Bitcoin and a new set of companies that are trying to decentralize finance. So first, blockchain as corporate infrastructure. So in 2008, the Bitcoin white paper was released. In 2009, it's launched. Bitcoin is an online currency that can be sent and received peer-to-peer by anyone in the world. With Bitcoin, computers, not humans, control the transfer and creation of money. So it's really hard to start a conversation about blockchain without first defining Bitcoin, so there it is. For corporates, though, getting involved with Bitcoin early, as interesting as it was really difficult. The first people that were attracted to Bitcoin were largely anti-establishment, anti-government. You can see here an example of a dark web marketplace, the Silk Road, that was shut down by the FBI and other agencies a couple years ago, and where people used Bitcoin to purchase drugs, weapons, other bad things. So corporates approached this and said, we want to distinguish the blockchain from Bitcoin. And here's a quote from Martin Chavez, the CFO of Goldman Sachs. We really want to distinguish the blockchain, which is an area of huge emphasis and investments across our industry and across many industries, from a particular application of blockchain, which tends to get all the news cycles, which is cryptocurrencies. So what is a blockchain? A blockchain is a database where untrusted parties come to agreement on the state of the database without using a middleman. So let's take Bitcoin as an example. There's no company, there's no organization, there's no person behind Bitcoin. There's just a lot of people all working together to run a protocol. And the Bitcoin token, the actual money on the network, incentivizes different actors to continue to propagate and sustain the network. For banks, that idea of having this database that nobody controls but everyone collaborates on is a very interesting idea. So banks were the first to get involved, the first to really look at blockchain technology. You can see here the investments in blockchain by Citi, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. All three invested in digital asset and Exoni, which are looking at clearance and settlement solutions, and also joined consortia like R3, which are bringing together competitors to collaborate on the technology. And everyone's jumping on the hype cycle. Other corporates haven't been far behind, ranging across industries as diverse as Kodak to IBM to Visa and MasterCard. These are mentions of blockchain on earnings calls, and everyone seems to be interested. The problem is that lots of pilots have stalled, and the jury is still out on some other high-profile projects. So you can see here projects with the DTCC, Euroclear, BHP Billiton have largely ground to a halt. And projects that are still to be determined include R3, Digital Asset, Exoni, Hyperledger, and others. Here's a quote from Murray Posmanter at the DTCC talking about the blockchain technology that they explored. Basically, it became a solution in search of a problem. And that's really to highlight that existing technologies might be able to be used for the same problems for much cheaper and much more efficiently. So why might a blockchain be a bad fit for business? Well, first of all, let's go back to our definition. A blockchain is a database where untrusted parties come to agreement on the state of the database without using a middleman. So we have to get everyone to agree. Well, consensus isn't easy. So imagine trying to get systems within one organization to talk to each other, and now, multiply that out exponentially, and there you have your corporate blockchain. The second piece of this is that users are sovereign. So there's no one administering the blockchain. There's no administrator. That means that if there's a rogue company, a rogue actor, there's no one to kick them out. Everyone's on a level playing field. The database is accessed by anyone in this case. And the last thing that we should then take from that is that centralization is often better, faster, cheaper, unless you really have a use case for decentralization, and unless you really don't want some sort of administrator, you probably don't need a blockchain. According to our new Next framework, we see enterprise blockchains as still largely experimental. And we really think of blockchain as part of a much larger conversation. This isn't to discount blockchain. This has been somewhat dismissive of corporate blockchains. But that's not the point here. The point here is that blockchain is part of a much larger conversation around data collaboration, storage, sharing. As you can see here, blockchain is a subset of distributed databases, which itself is a subset of databases generally. So that's how we're thinking about it, and that's how corporates should continue to think about the blockchain technology as corporate infrastructure piece. The second part of this presentation, this talk, is tokens, ICOs, and how companies are trying to build a decentralized web. Here's a quote from Stephen Johnson, who wrote an article in the New York Times called Beyond the Bitcoin Bubble. I'll read it now. The real promise of these new technologies, many of their evangelists believe, lies not in displacing our currencies, but in replacing much of what we now think of as the internet, while at the same time returning the online world to a more decentralized and egalitarian system. So what does that mean? Today, the web has become quite centralized. There are big, giant companies that we all know and love that hold lots of our data, and sometimes that leads to things like Cambridge Analytica or other data breaches and privacy issues. So the theory behind tokens is that we can build networks that operate by themselves, that operate in a decentralized manner. So take Bitcoin as an example. Again, there's nobody in charge of Bitcoin. The network just continues to operate because of game theory and incentive mechanisms that incentivize different actors to use the network, right? So the idea behind tokens is that we can build similar networks. We could build a decentralized Facebook, let's say, or a decentralized social network, and users would spend tokens, other suppliers of the computing power would earn tokens, and there would be no company in the middle. It would just be a network, a self-perpetuating protocol. And as you can see in this market map, there's a token for every area of the internet, from e-commerce to exchanges to asset management to crowdfunding, lending, payments, banking, supply chain. Really spans the spectrum. And the way that these companies have raised money over the past year is through ICOs. So in this chart, we see how an ICO generally happens. A blockchain startup seeks cash. The startup sells scarce tokens. Tokens are traded on exchanges. And then hopefully, eventually, the startup ships a decentralized application where the tokens can be used. The problem that we've seen so far is that the startups that are launching many of these companies are not really making it to stage 4. And indeed, we're seeing tons of money going to them, perhaps overcapitalization, and we're seeing other instances of bad actors engaging in regulatory arbitrage. So they'll bounce from one jurisdiction to another, launch an ICO, hope that regulators don't crack down, or just avoid them altogether. And just to give a sense of how much money has been raised over the past year, completed ICOs raised about $18 billion in a single year. You can see here on the far right, in pink, EOS, which held a year-long ICO and raised over $4 billion. In the orange, you see Telegram, which is a popular social network and messaging application, which raised $1.7 billion in a private sale. And then the navy is just traditional, I guess, ICOs and how much money they've raised. The good news is that regulators are waking up. Here's a quote from Jay Clayton, who is the chairman of the SEC. Tokens are used to finance projects. I've been on the record saying there are very few. There's no tokens that I've seen that aren't securities. And obviously, if you're issuing unlicensed securities, that's a very big deal and very illegal. The other problem with this idea of decentralizing the web is that the biggest winners so far have been centralized. So the biggest winners are centralized exchanges. When you hear about Bitcoin getting hacked or Bitcoin, people lost money in a Bitcoin hack, what they're talking about is centralized exchanges being hacked. So here's Coinbase, which has a pretty good record on security. You can see its valuation jump in a single year from about $1 billion to $8 billion, just as a result of all the speculation and trading mania. And just to drive home the point that most of the users that are using blockchain networks are traders and speculators, here's CryptoKitties. So CryptoKitties was a popular decentralized game when it launched. Since that point, last November, it's seen daily active users in the hundreds, and not many people continue to use it. So most of the users that have been drawn to cryptocurrencies, ICOs, are speculating or trading. And as you can see here, as the price of Bitcoin has slid and speculation has somewhat died down, exchanges who made a lot of money over the past year are launching venture arms, acquiring companies, and looking for the use case that will bring actual usage to the space. And for something a bit odd, consider this quote from Ted Livingston. Kik was a company that raised about $100 million in its ICO. It's also a popular social network. Almost nobody should be looking at blockchain unless you're trying to build one of the most used cryptocurrencies in the world. It's very low odds that blockchain is going to create value for you. So that's obviously pretty strange. So now let's go to our last bit, building a new financial world. So far we've looked at the corporate angle, we've looked at the tokens and ICO angle, and now let's look at Bitcoin and get back to basics for a moment. So with all this, we've been pretty real, a lot of realism in this talk. Is there room for optimism? Here are two areas that we're watching. The first is Bitcoin as a fiat alternative, and the second is a public decentralization of the financial stack. So first, let's think about Bitcoin, and actually let's go back to our definition from the beginning. Bitcoin is an online currency that can be sent peer-to-peer between anyone in the world. With Bitcoin, computers, not humans, control the creation and transfer of money. So here's a quote from Dong He at the IMF. It kind of highlights the point we're trying to make here. Cryptocurrencies may one day serve as alternative means of payment and possibly units of account, which would reduce the demand for fiat currencies or central bank money. It's time to revisit the question, will monetary policy remain effective in a world without central bank money? So let's just think about this for a second. Let's think about Bitcoin not as an alternative to the US dollar, but perhaps to the Venezuelan bolivar. And there's a story that I heard a couple months ago at this point of people in Venezuela mining Bitcoin to purchase credit cards in the United States, which would buy food on Amazon that was then shipped to Florida and finally shipped to Venezuela. So you can really see the use case there and see the potential for something quite interesting and quite compelling. And the important thing here is that Bitcoin hasn't died yet. Here are Bitcoin obituaries by year, or articles saying that Bitcoin is going to die or has died. It hasn't happened yet. Like we mentioned, it has never been hacked. There's no company behind it. There's only exchanges that have been hacked. So really, Bitcoin, according to articles that we've seen and research that we've done, is here to stay. More importantly than that, though, is that scaling solutions are rolling out in force. So one of the problems that Bitcoin has faced in the past is transaction speed. So it's pretty hard to buy a coffee with Bitcoin because transaction speeds are pretty low. So the Lightning Network is an effort to improve transaction speed, and we're seeing a lot of development there as it continues to grow and find users. In the same vein, a number of new companies are trying to decentralize finance in the way that Bitcoin is trying to decentralize money. So here's a quote from Will Warren, the CEO of 0x. 0x is a protocol for decentralized exchanges. We envision a world in which all forms of value are tokenized on public blockchains. Combined with a set of open financial primitives, we can build a global financial system that is more efficient, transparent, and equitable than any system that has existed in the past. So what does that mean? Let's imagine a world where stocks, bonds, real estate, even derivatives are all tokenized and placed onto public blockchains. What does that look like? Well, it might mean a world where there's fewer databases, there's ones that are trusted, and perhaps most importantly, they're interoperable. So you would potentially decentralize trust around important and valuable assets. And then combined with other parts of a decentralized financial stack, this could have huge implications. And top VCs like Andreessen, USV, are betting on this thesis with investments into companies operating in this specific subsector. So that could include Harbor, Basis, DYDX, and others. Let's have a look at two of these. So Basis is building a stablecoin that hopes to be more stable than popular cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. The theory behind this is to peg a cryptocurrency to the US dollar and then issue or automatically issue base bonds to regulate the price and make sure that it stays at the peg. Another thesis in this space of decentralized finance is Harbor. And this Harbor is offering a compliant platform to tokenize assets like real estate, company equity, debt. And this could have broad implications for interoperability and cash and illiquidity. So just as an example, you could imagine if you tokenized real estate as well as your Apple stock, you might be able to pay off your mortgage with your Apple stock and never convert it into cash, which is pretty compelling, and the thought experiment goes pretty deep. So with that, let's recap. First, we looked at the corporate angle, the blockchain technology as corporate infrastructure thesis. It still has to prove itself. We've seen a lot of money poured into that sector, but not many results yet. People are still building, still developing, so it's an area that we're watching closely. The second thing we looked at was the ICO mania, tokens. They haven't rebuilt the web yet. Granted, it's still early days. Teams have lots of runway ahead of them, lots of money to continue to build and develop, and it's an area that we're watching very closely. And the third is Bitcoin. We noted that Bitcoin hasn't gone anywhere. And in the same vein, there's a new set of companies that are cropping up, receiving funding, and looking to entirely decentralize the financial stack. And that's all. Thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions, please find me afterwards.